So a while back I covered Bad Day at Cat Rock, one of the first videos I ever received in my entire life. Over 20 years later, it holds up remarkably well. I believe it to be the first cartoon related video in my entire collection, arriving long before Cartoon Network. If it wasn't the first, that honour goes to the birthday video collection from 1989. I have wanted to cover this video for a long time. It's been on my to-do list, but there's always been a video or two that make me push this one back. Now it's time to cover this rather historical release. In July 1869, two homeless boys known as Fred and George were adopted and received into the first National Children's Home by Minister Thomas Bowman Stevenson. It may have seemed like a small supportive act back in the mid-19th century, but 120 years later, this act had evolved into one of the UK's biggest charities, National Children's Home, now known as Action for Children, which helps over 300,000 children annually. In 1989, Warner Brothers, MGM and Disney collaborated to create this video in celebration of the charity's 120th anniversary, with all proceeds going to NCH. The goal was to raise an extra £1 million for NCH from the sales of this release. Granted, I wasn't around back in those days, so I can't say for sure, but knowing how massive this charity is, I would not be surprised if the goal was met. But here we are, almost 30 years later. VHS is pretty much a dead technology, and as NCH has gone through two name changes, I wouldn't be at all surprised if this was a pretty obscure release. But let's see how well it holds up. This video holds 7 cartoons, 2 from both MGM and Disney, and 3 from Warner Brothers. From Warner, we have Room and Bird from 1951, Devil May Hare from 1954, and An Egg Scramble from 1950. From MGM, we have Tom and Jerry's The Cat Concerto from 1947, and Bear and the Bean from 1948. As for Disney, we have How to Be a Detective from 1952, and the DuckTales episode Magica's Magic Mirror from 1987. 29 years after the initial release and 15 years after my last viewing, is it still enjoyable to watch? Sorta. Of course, the Tom and Jerry cartoon is great, go figure, but as for the rest of it, there are some aspects that are better than I remember, and there are some aspects that are worse than I remember. In the latter case, Warner is the biggest loser. Egg Scramble has always been the worst cartoon in the entire collection, and I'd argue that Room and Bird has aged really badly and is probably one of the worst Tweety cartoons I have ever seen. It's not terrible, just not particularly great. Which is a shame because I really liked it back in the 90s. On the other hand, The Bear and the Bean is confusing as all hell, but has aged really well. As for Disney, How to Be a Detective, for me, is an incredibly obscure goofy short that I could barely remember as a kid. Certainly didn't like it that much. These days, I've actually come to appreciate it more than ever. It's silly, but very charming. And as for DuckTales, of course I enjoy that. Enjoyed it as a kid, enjoyed it as an adult with nothing better to do than to run a generic review series on the internet. I don't plan on covering the series fully, but it's safe to say that DuckTales is one of the most iconic animated television productions of the past 30 years. I've never heard a bad word against it. If anything, one thing this video omits is the theme music, which I'd argue is the second best theme song to any cartoon in history.
Danger, watch behind you. There's a stranger out to find you. What to do? Just grab onto some DuckTales. Woo! Every day that I've been making DuckTales. Woo! Tales of daring, new, bad, and good DuckTales. Woo! Not ponytails or counting tails. No DuckTales. Woo!
Tremendous, ain't it? One of the absolute best. If I'm brutally honest, there's only one theme song that can beat DuckTales, and it's a surprising winner.
Anything's possible. At Flying Rhino Junior High. Yeah, anything is possible. At Flying Rhino Junior High.
trust an obscure cartoon from the 90s to have a better theme song than all of my top 5 cartoons put together. So Birthday Video Collection is a mixed and incredibly obscure experience. Does that make it a bust? I don't think so. Deep down, the only cartoon I genuinely don't like is Egg Scrambled. And that's right at the end. I can live with the rest of them. I have a soft spot for my early collection, and it was for a good cause, so I still consider this video a winner. Right, we've had something from the new millennium, something from the 90s, and something from the 80s. Let's keep going back. Let's have something from the 70s. Well, we're gonna start by going forward before we go back. Make sense? Great!